Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week we're featuring two segments. First up, Phil Wilayto of the Virginia Defenders talks about the conditions at Red Onion State Prison in Western Virginia, where a number of prisoners have been self-immolating in order to escape long-term isolation, medical neglect, and racist guard violence. Then you'll hear Joe, an anarchist from Germany, speaking about the ongoing buildup of conspiracy cases against antifascists known as Antifa-OST or Antifa East. You can check out the show notes for links where you can find more information about these situations.
Phil Wilayto, him, a co-founder of the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, based here in Richmond, Virginia. We're an all-volunteer community multi-issue organization. I'm the editor of our quarterly newspaper, the Virginia Defender, a co-founder of the Virginia Prison Justice Network, and coordinator of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Can you tell listeners and myself a little bit about the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, like how it started, what you all do? It sounds like you're out of Richmond, but if it's got chapters in different places or just pretty centralized?
Yeah, we have a few members in other parts of the state, but the bulk is in Richmond. But the newspaper's carried in 16 cities and counties with a press run of 15,000. So it has some presence. We started back in 2002. There were four of us. And the way it started, ironically, was around a situation at Red Onion State Prison. I was a staff reporter with the Richmond Free Press at the time, and we got a call from a man named Ben Plummer, who told us that his brother Thomas was being held in solitary in Red Onion and had been there for 6 months, and there was no end date to his confinement. He had brought charges against 3 guards and 1 officer when he was confined at Wallens Ridge State Prison, which at the time was also classified as a supermax, like Red Onion. And he actually got the case into court, but our understanding is that the Department of Corrections manipulated the jury, and Thomas lost the case. Then he was transferred to Red Onion and put into solitary, administrative solitary, which is open-ended. So at that time, one phone call to at that time, the director of the Department of Corrections, Harold Clark, who is no progressive, resulted in Thomas being released, and he's out of the system now. But Ben and his wife, TJ Plummer, suggested that we stay together as a group, the 3 of us, and also Anna Edwards, who was my girlfriend at the time and now my wife of 18 years, and form an organization to continue to work on prison issues and other related issues. And Ben came up with the name of Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. And that was our beginning. We initially worked around pretty much exclusively issues of jails and prisons. And then we got into some community issues like lead poisoning, housing discrimination, police murders, investigating cases. Some of them actually went to trial. And in 1 or 2 cases, there were some officers convicted. We always have been involved in the anti-war movement, locally and nationally and internationally. And what we're probably best known for is our 20-year participation in an ongoing struggle to reclaim and properly memorialize the section of downtown Richmond that was once the second largest slave market in the country, and as importantly, if not more so, the fountainhead for the U.S. domestic slave trade, the epicenter, the market from which other markets further south got their human. I keep trying to think of a good word that is not insulting but is also accurate. But they were, buying and selling human beings like commodities, and so many that half of all Black people in the United States could likely trace some ancestry to Shacklebottom, including my wife, Anna. So that's been a long, long struggle that has resulted in the city agreeing to $250 million project to build a 10-acre memorial park, an interpretive center, and possibly a slavery museum. And Anna went back to school to get a degree in history, a master's degree, and is now one of the 5 public historians consulting on how this story will be told. So that's been a long part of what we do. Of course, all the contracts are for building the park are going to white-owned companies, and that's where the struggle is at today. But prison work, anti-war, the shackle bottom, sacred, what we call sacred ground work in the newspaper, those are the primary things we work on. And then we support, many local struggles through the newspaper and our other activities.
Yeah, and just to say, I was just checking out the masthead for the paper on at virginiadefender.org. In the spirit of Gabriel and Nan, Nat Turner, John Brown, Mary Bowser, Elizabeth Van Loo, John Mitchell Jr., Barbara Johns, Oliver Hill, and all who struggle for justice. That's really powerful. I don't know if you want to say a few words about some of the names that show up in there, some of the ways that they're remembered, or your part alongside of the memory of that sacred ground. I guess the legacy of the struggle against these institutions.
Well, Gabriel was an enslaved blacksmith born in 1776 or thereabouts. So he grew up in a revolutionary period and was affected by the rhetoric of the time, but also by the Haitian Revolution. He was literate, so he could read newspapers. And he wasn't confined to the plantation where he was born. He was allowed to go into Richmond and contract for jobs and stay overnight and just bring his wages back to the plantation. And he devised a plan for a massive rebellion against slavery. And it grew from January of 1800 to August and involved hundreds of people, enslaved and free. Also, some white workers, indigenous people, a couple of Frenchmen who had fought at the Battle of Yorktown, and others, more marginalized people in society. And they had planned to march on Richmond and take the governor captive and negotiate an end to slavery. If it wasn't for a terrible rainstorm that wiped out the roads and the bridges, they might have succeeded. And he was executed on October 10th, 1800. And every year for 22 years, we gather at what we believe to be the site of his execution and hold a Gabriel gathering to remember him and honor his memory and the other conspirators, including his wife, Nan. And his name is now popular and famous enough that the African American Studies Department at Virginia Commonwealth University named the building where it's headquartered, the Gabriel House. Much more needs to be done to, keep his memory alive, but that's one of the things. And then the other people were active in various struggles. Elizabeth Van Loo and Mary Bowser were Union spies in the city of Richmond, very courageous. Elizabeth was a white woman. Mary Bowser was black, and they had some incredible adventures and were recognized as two of the most important sources of information for the Union Army, right under the noses of the Confederacy. John Mitchell Jr. was the fighting editor of the Richmond Planet newspaper, who was a fierce opponent to lynching and co-led a year-long boycott of the city's streetcar system when the 1902 Virginia Constitution legalized segregation in public transit. So all of these people, that mentioned there, Barbara Johns, who at 16 years old led a walkout of her high school in Farmsville, Virginia, and a case taken up by Oliver Hill, also mentioned there, a civil rights attorney, and that case was rolled over into Brown versus Education. So these were all heroes of the Black liberation struggle, the civil rights movement, whites who supported those struggles. And we like to think of our newspaper as in the spirit of that resistance.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very concise. I can hear you've had to explain that a number of times before. That was very practiced and good.
We do get asked questions occasionally.
Yeah. I guess on a more serious note, reports have been circulating about self-immolation among prisoners at Red Onion State Prison in Western Virginia. Can you talk about what's known at this time about who's done this and what the conditions are?
Yeah. Red Onion is the state's only supermax prison. It was built in 98 or 99, along with Wallens Ridge. And it was meant to be a prison, quote, for the worst of the worst. And it came out of a whole series of articles, mainly by a guy named John Diallo, who eventually wound up in George Bush administration for faith-based initiatives. And he postulated that there was a coming generation of what he called super predators who would be beyond redemption and wreak havoc in the country, and there'd be a lot of them, and the state had to prepare a place to put them. And it resulted in, accelerated prison construction, including these supermax prisons, where most people are held in cells for 23 hours a day. A lot of the people there, although the public perception is these people committed horrible crimes, and some did, but some people are also transferred there from lower level of security for infractions of the local rules, and in some cases just for getting on the wrong side of an administrator or a guard. You can get sent there for petty things. And I was down at the Richmond City Jail some years ago waiting to speak with an inmate, and I got to talking with one of the guards, an African-American man. And he told me, we got to talking about Red Onion, and he told me that he had a cousin who was sent there as a prisoner. And when he got off the bus, a white guard walked up to him and punched him full in the face and said, "Welcome to Red Onion." Red Onion has been the subject of damning reports by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, many, many court suits. One of the grossest ones that I'm aware of is by a man named Nicholas Reyes, R-E-Y-E-S. He was a Salvadoran immigrant, and he was at Red Onion, and they put him in solitary confinement, so completely isolated. And they have what they call a step-down program, a series of things, of hoops you're supposed to jump through in order to be released from solitary. But part of it is a written test. You have to fill out some forms. And Mr. Rees only spoke Spanish, and he was not literate in Spanish or any other language, so he couldn't take the test. They kept Nicholas Rees in solitary for 13 years. And by the time he got out, he couldn't speak. He couldn't recognize his mother. He had basically lost his mind. They gave him a settlement of $115,000, which I figure worked out to about $1 a day for all the time he had spent in solitary. Another man would spend 600 days in solitary. There was a settlement in his case. And of course, it's not just Red Onion. One statistic that is really revealing is Business Insider did a report last year on the use of dogs in prison. And they calculated that in the 5 years that ended, I think it was 2 years ago, there have been at least 295 cases of dogs biting incarcerated people. 24 of those cases were in 4 other states, and 271 were in Virginia. So that alone, I think, tells you that something is terribly wrong with the state system. And when you get up to Red Onion, which is a 6-7 hour drive west of Richmond, just a few miles from the Kentucky border, an extremely rural area, regardless of what the law says, regardless of what the Department of Corrections guidelines says, regardless of what the Department of Corrections tells the public, the administration and the guards are free to do virtually anything they want. And in Ekong Eshiet's case, he's one of the men who burned himself. We've been in touch. He told me he poured grease on his leg and set it off with some kind of an electrical device he had hooked up. And he waited 1 minute and 7 seconds, he said, so to make sure that it burned really well. And the reason is there's no burn units in the western part of the state. And for that kind of a terrible burn, you have to be brought to Richmond, to the VCU Health burn unit. And a prisoner had actually done this a year ago and wound up getting transferred out of Red Onion for follow-up medical care. And that was the motivation. Well, Ekong Eshiet, who was born in Nigeria, has given interviews with prison radio and with ourselves and other news outlets. And he said that he just couldn't take the racism anymore. Guards would come up, and his last name is Eshiet. They would call him E. They would continually use the N-word. They did a search of his cell one time and deliberately threw his Quran on the floor. And they spit in his food and then handed it to him. He just couldn't take it anymore. And so he burns himself. Demetrius Wallace told me he poured boiling water on his leg. I don't know the particular circumstances of the other people. Kevin Rashid Johnson is a longtime prisoner activist and author, a self-described revolutionary, and a wonderful artist. And he went on a 71-day hunger strike last year, starting in December of 23. And because he felt he had serious medical conditions that he said were not being properly addressed, And he suspected that the authorities were trying to eliminate him by what's known as death by medical neglect. So he went on a hunger strike and stayed on it for 71 days. And it went on so long that his body could no longer retain fluids. He had to be brought to VCU Health, and eventually he was transferred to Greensville Correctional Center. He's since been moved back to Red Onion. And he was in the medical unit when Ikong Eshia was brought in for follow-up treatment after going to VCU. I believe it was after he went to VCU and not before. And Ikong told Rashid that about 12 men had set themselves on fire as a way to try to get out of Red Onion. And Rashid wrote up the story with background on Red Onion and sent it out far and wide. It got picked up by prison radio. We contacted the local affiliate of NPR and the local daily newspaper, but they wouldn't touch it because they said it was hearsay and it wasn't proved. So we went on a 10-day in-depth investigation ourselves, and I believe we proved that Demetrius Wallace and Ikong Eshia had both burned themselves so badly that they were brought to VCU Health and then brought back to Red Onion. After that story came out, Radio IQ, affiliated with NPR, did a story and got the Department of Corrections to admit that 5 people had burned themselves. I called up to Red Onion when we first got the news from Rashid, and the warden told me that no one had burned themselves. So Radio IQ did a story, and then the local paper was still not interested, but we, or at least said they were busy with other stories. And then the Latin Times online publication picked up our story, and that caught the attention of the Black Caucus of the Virginia State Legislature, the General Assembly, and they issued a call to the governor, the state attorney general, and the director of the Department of Corrections to investigate this situation. And as a result of that, the Department of Corrections issued a statement saying that 6 people had burned themselves. And the governor issued a statement saying that no one had set themselves on fire, that some people had injured themselves. Well, I don't know the particular circumstances of everyone. Apparently, Ikong described it as people setting themselves on fire. If he poured grease on his leg and set it off with some kind of electrical device, I would assume there would be some flames. But the governor also said that there was no self-immolation. So we looked that up in the dictionary, Merriam-Webster, and self-immolation is harming oneself to draw attention to a cause, often by fire. So often by fire, but not exclusively by fire. These were self-immolations. Anyway, tomato. At least 6 people, according to the DOC, burned themselves so badly that some of them had to be transported 6-7 hours to Richmond for treatment. The question is why? Why did these people take this drastic action? The attention has been phenomenal. It's been a firestorm of media coverage. From finally the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper did a story. There's been a follow-up by Radio IQ, Al-Jazeera, the Guardian newspaper, The Intercept, NBC News. The New York Times did a story on December 1st. We just saw something from Hindustan Times in India. It's become an incredible story and an incredible public relations problem for the Department of Corrections and Governor Glenn Youngkin. So some advocates have been calling on the governor, the state attorney general, and the Department of Corrections to investigate the situation. And we took a different turn. We're calling on members of the General Assembly, the state legislature, to do an investigation because we don't believe the governor, the state attorney general, or the Department of Corrections itself would do an honest investigation. We're hoping that honest members of the General Assembly will go out. There have been people who have gone out there and come back and said everything's fine. So you can have a setup like that. Or they could go out there and the administration could intimidate the prisoners and tell them they better be careful what they say. But Ikong Eshia and Demetrius Wallace have told me that they're anxious to speak with the media or anyone else about the situation. Kevin Rashid Johnson has been held in solitary, incommunicado, cannot even communicate with his attorney, Miriam Nesbitt, out of D.C., and we're very worried about his situation. And if people do go from the General Assembly, we're urging them to speak to Ikong and Demetrius and Rashid particularly to make sure that they are safe and they're not being retaliated against. Demetrius told me he got a charge for self-harm, which among other things helped prove that it actually happened, because that's a written charge. So where we're at now is there's certainly a strong public searchlight on Red Onion, but whether or not anything is going to happen is a question. So we're having a public meeting. The Virginia Defenders are having a public meeting in Richmond on Saturday at 2:00. We're going to be showing the documentary by Apple Shop, Up the Ridge, which is an examination of conditions at the Wallens Ridge State Prison. And then we're going to have a public meeting with speakers and reading from statements from Red Onion folks who have burnt themselves and other people who can talk about the conditions there. We'll have some solidarity statements, and we'll be urging people from that meeting to contact their representatives in the General Assembly. And we have some other ideas on how to keep pressure up. The next issue of our paper comes out in January. We'll have a follow-up story there, and we will be putting out stories in between on our updates and announcement e-newsletter. And we're in conversations with the other advocacy groups about how to better coordinate our work and make sure that the situation is not just covered up and blows over.
Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, and just to say, so that Up the Ridge is an amazing film. I don't cry during movies very much. It definitely tore me up a little bit to watch it, but I'm really glad that Apple Shop does amazing work, and it's a really powerful film. But so you mentioned that Rashid had been engaging in a hunger strike that lasted 71 days that started in December of last year. And one reason that case, which we covered on the show, got so much, when it did get noticed, it did get some notice, in part because up to, I think, 17 people were participating at one point alongside of Rashid in a hunger strike, not because necessarily they were experiencing the same medical neglect that Rashid was, but because they were literally being tortured just by, if nothing else about like the racism among the staff there, because they were experiencing these long-term stints in isolation with no recourse. So this is clearly, and that Up the Ridge film was produced a number of years ago. I want to say it's like 2012 or something like that. Do you remember when it was made? It's okay if you don't.
I don't know the exact date, but I can tell you that the conditions described there are very similar to the letters that we regularly receive from people at Red Onion, which we will be reading on Saturday.
Yeah. So this is like, I guess what I'm getting at is that there's this like long-term systemic issue with these isolated supermax prisons that have these programs of long-term isolation 23 hours a day, or then getting in the hole beyond that. We're isolating people who are majority from cities. It's mostly black and brown prisoners, as Noelle Hanrahan said in the Al-Jazeera interview that's at the top of that SF Bayview article that you wrote, which I'll link in the show notes. It's a really good interview. And it's a mostly white staff, like rural white staff of people that have a lack of oversight, a lack of, like, they're pretty insulated by distance. One of the things that Rashid's supporters were stating, and that advocates of all the people that were on hunger strike around the use of extended isolation at this facility, they were pointing out that the assembly had passed a bill earlier that said that, it was earlier in this, I think in 2024, stating that long-term isolation, like, you couldn't put people in long-term isolation without recourse. There had to be a written record of why someone was being put in isolation and a reason given, but that this small procedure wasn't being followed even at these prisons, or at this prison at Red Onion. Was there a misunderstanding about that? Is that a concern that I could see people in the legislature being concerned that they got together, they made a law, and the executive is stymieing and challenging the application of that law in practice? Like, is that a point of leverage, or does it seem kind of like a moot point?
Well, I mean, there's two things: what the law actually said and then how it's applied. The law has a loophole in it, which is that a prison administrator, warden, can impose solitary confinement if he or she feels it's necessary for the safety and good order of the prison. So in other words, they can do whatever they want. At different times, the Department of Corrections has claimed that they no longer have solitary confinement because they changed the name to restorative housing. In California, it's called SHU, Special Housing Unit, tomato. You put someone in a box and leave them there for 30, 60, 90 days. That's solitary confinement. So I think one of the things that happened last year was prisoners at Red Onion thought that solitary confinement had been eliminated. And when people were still being sent to solitary, they were really angry. And so some people, that was the motivation for them going on a hunger strike. Others had their own individual situations, several in cases dealing with what they felt was lack of medical care for serious medical problems, which is a very, very, very common complaint that we hear. Some will get a biopsy and they won't get the results back for 6 months. And when they get the results back, turns out they have cancer and it's been advancing. And that gets proven by, outside doctors. So that was a hunger strike that maybe as many as 30 men participated in. I do want to address the issue of the isolation of Red Onion and Wallens Ridge. 35 years ago, there was a historic coal miners' strike in Southwest Virginia against the Pittston Coal Company. And the company was trying to eliminate health benefits for retirees. And the miners felt that that was something that was won by their parents and grandparents and that they owed to their children and grandchildren to preserve. And they carried out a very, very militant strike that eventually wound up seizing control over a coal processing plant in a very rural forested area and held it for 4 days. 99 miners and a Methodist supporter minister took over the tipple and ran out the scabs and the administration and held it for 4 days while the union officially, not a wildcat, officially surrounded the coal tipple, as it's called, with 5,000 coal miners and supporters, while the governor Belials was threatening to call in the state police, which he didn't, but they were ready. And I worked on strike support for that strike. Dave Cormier with the Hospital Workers Union. I was with the UAW at the time. We wrote the first support leaflet for the strike and set up meetings in cities up and down the East Coast and the Midwest so miners could come and tell their story and get support for the strike fund. We were there for the coal tipple takeover. And I wrote a book about it, which we're releasing later this year on the 35th anniversary of the strike. And Cecil Roberts, who led the strike and is now the president of the mine workers, has written an introduction to the book. It's called We Won't Go Back, Lessons of the Pittston Coal Strike for the Labor Movement. And the reason I bring that up is because I got to know a lot of miners and their family members, stayed with them in their homes, broke bread with them, stayed out in Camp Solidarity in the woods with them. And I don't buy this prejudice against rural people that everyone's a racist. That's not true. And I really kind of bristle when people assume that just because people are country folk that they have to be racist. On the other hand, there are guards at Red Onion who openly flaunt white supremacist tattoos that regularly use the N-word against prisoners. The vast majority of the guards are white, and the vast majority of the prisoners are black. And not only is there a racial difference, but you have urban black men being kept in confinement by rural white men. So there's a cultural difference and often an ignorance, of black culture, which can lead to misinterpretations. And then you throw in, a heavy dose of racism and the fact that there's really no consequences. Even if a warden wanted to get rid of a racist guard, a racist, brutal guard, he or she would have to think, how are they going to replace this person? Because they're shorthanded. They don't pay the guards very much. It's not a job that someone would move to the area to get. So they're always shorthanded. People are pulling double shifts, which contributes to tension. So even in the best of circumstances, you've got a systemic problem. And then you've got the addition of racism and racist brutality and really no recourse. Then you get to a situation where people are ready to severely burn themselves in order to get out of that situation. And that ought to be enough to force some kind of a complete outside independent investigation and systemic changes at the prison, and ultimately a recognition that this supermax was founded on a lie, that it's always been brutal, it's always been horrific in its treatment of prisoners, and it needs to be shut down.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I totally agree that the presumption that rural folks or white folks are necessarily racist is a lazy step. But I think also, like, to speak to what you're talking about with like the power dynamics there and the cultural differences to between like folks that are living rurally and folks that are living in an urban setting. On top of that, there's the pre-existing like prominence of white supremacist speaking points. And that actually, and that shapes the culture of how, you know, many of us view the other, how we view people other than us in the society. And when it comes to like systemic access to resources and privileges of white folks over other folks, there's oftentimes a way that acts, you know, that's acted out on through white supremacist violence. And like Rashid, who we've been speaking about, wrote an article this last year, I believe, that's up on rashidmod.com, his website, where he talks about development of gangs within the Virginia Department of Corrections in prisons. And in particular, he was writing at the time during his last period before the medical transfer, talking about the creation of gangs in these Western Virginia prisons of Wallens Ridge and Red Onion. And like, I think put in the context of the discourse of super predators that like Biden was definitely a part of advocating in the 90s and the early 90s. There was a story told about why we needed these kinds of facilities, how our society was degrading, and who was at fault for that, and what the resolution was. And so supermaxes, isolation, mass incarceration of mostly black and brown and in general poor bodies became the solution that was proposed to us. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these sorts of facilities, this approach towards the penal system, and how it stands in terms of white supremacy in the U.S.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that, you know, all societies have prisons at the present stage in history, but the United States prison system grew out of the need to control black labor. That was really not the only motivation, but a major motivation. The old name penitentiary comes from a Quaker view that rather than corporal punishment, people should be confined so they can think about their crimes and make penance. But from a point of view of labor, the only reason the United States developed into a country was because of agriculture. That was its main economic activity. And that was dependent, in order to be profitable, that was dependent on slave labor. So after emancipation, not only the Southern slave owners, but the entire economy needed to find a way to continue to exploit labor. And the easiest target, because of the history, was black labor. And so in prison, people were picked up for petty offenses, in some cases, no offenses. For example, vagrancy laws. You don't have a job, you can't prove you have a means of employment, we put you in jail. And then the jails would rent out the inmates to private corporations or plantations. And this would be, you know, a way of bringing money in for the prison or for the state. The famous story of John Henry, the miner who challenged a machine to see who could be more productive and efficient and died with a hammer in his hand. He was a prisoner from the Spring State Penitentiary here in Richmond who was rented out to a mining company. And so that was a common thing. In the height of the Great Depression, there were about 65,000 black people in prison total at the height. And today, where there's twice as many black people in the country as there were then, if the numbers had continued in a linear way, we'd have 130,000 black people in prison. Instead, we have about 1.2 million. And I think the reason is in the Depression, it was understood that depression at some point would end and there would be a need for low-wage laborers who would be black workers. But today, the economy has changed so much that there is not going to be, couldn't absorb the 2.2 million people that are in prisons today in the United States. 4% of the world's population, over 20% of the world's prisoners. So I think it's a means of controlling labor. And of course, once people are in prison, you know, they work. Virginia, they're paid between 27 cents and 45 cents an hour for doing jobs in the prison. And then you have the prison industries where people produce things for sale to other state institutions. Every piece of furniture at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond is made by prisoners, and the university is forced by law to buy that furniture from prisons. And then there's, the private corporations that will operate within the prison walls. So it's continually a means of controlling black labor and controlling the. I remember talking to my mother one time. My dad grew up in the Depression. He grew up in foster homes. It was very difficult to find a job when he got out of the system, and he went to work for a year in the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's work programs. Then he went out to the woods and he planted trees, and he was making $5 a week, and he was feeling pretty good during that time. And I said, "See, Mom, that's when the unions were strong and they were demanding these kind of programs." And she said, "No, that wasn't it." And her father was a good union man, an organizer. She said it was because the government didn't want all these young men standing around with nothing to do on the outside. They were worried about that. See, I thought that was a really good insight. She was a smart lady. Never went further than high school, but I think the prison system today is a way to control a quantity of surplus workers that they don't need anymore, but they can make money off if they put into prisons. It costs more to keep someone in prison in Virginia than it would to send them to a state university. But there's a strong lobby of the organizations that make money, institutions, companies that make money from prisons. So the problems are systemic. It's not just that there are some bad guards. It's not just that there are some bad administrators. The entire system is not set up either to, quote, keep society safe or to rehabilitate prisoners. It's meant to control a section of the population that they really have no use for on the outside. And because of that, it's fundamentally flawed. Could there be a system, that was humane? I know people talk about abolition. I think we would all want to see society without cops, courts, prisons, and the military. But the prisons will be one of the last things to go. It's not going to be a demand we can win before there is a fundamental change in who runs this country. But in the meantime, they don't have to be inhumane places. They don't have to be cruel places. They don't have to be places where brutal racists can play out their fantasies against a vulnerable population. Prisoners say they send us to prison as punishment, not for punishment. And that's a good point. Being deprived of your freedom and your family and your friends, that's punishment. But to torture people psychologically and physically, that should be unacceptable in a civilized society. And yet it's been going on since the beginning of the first prison system. So, yeah, that's some rambling comments. I hope that's helpful.
No, I think it was very helpful and very insightful. Thank you very much for this conversation and for amplifying the voices of people that are going through this and getting more eyes on this situation. Hopefully there will be some sort of reportage or recordings or something from that gathering. But could you tell people again where they can keep up with news about this through the Virginia Defender, and suggest of a couple of ways that they can help amplify those stories and put pressure on ending this circumstances here?
Yeah, they can go to virginiadefender.org, virginiadefender.org. That's where we keep past copies of our newspaper. They can see the current issue that deals with Red Onion. Under prisoner essays, and I think also on the main page, there are several of Rashid's essays dealing with Red Onion and other prison matters and beyond. He's not just a writer, he's an analyst. He's a strategic thinker. And I've learned a lot from him about the way that he has viewed the prison system and, things like the introduction of gangs into the prison system, as he explains, allows the administration to pit prisoners against each other and so control them. That's something that's hard to understand, the enormity of the problems in the prison system, unless you really dig into it. You can tell anecdotal stories about how guards will pay one prisoner to attack another, and then the guards will stand around in the circle and watch and place bets and so on. Stories, that just come, we can't prove it. There's no video, but you hear the same stories from many different prisoners at many different times from different institutions who are not able to communicate with each other. And that's a pretty good indication that these stories have some validity. So people go on virginiadefender.org and also the Facebook page for the Virginia Defender. And we have a link there to the public meeting, Crisis at Red Onion Supermax, how you can help. The meeting will be Saturday, start at 2:00 at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church, 1720 Mechanicsville Turnpike in Richmond's East End. And the video of a link to the video of the meeting will be posted hopefully the following day at the Facebook page for the Virginia Defender. So I think that's all I got. And, thanks so much for the opportunity to get this information out. We are not pretending to speak for the prisoners. We're trying to amplify their voice, but definitely they did ask us to try to get the widest possible attention on this situation and the conditions. And if something dramatic doesn't change, I'm afraid the lesson to the Department of Corrections will be that they really are free to do anything they want. And it'll be 10 times harder to raise any other issue after this. It's 6 to 12 men taking a drastic step of burning themselves in order to escape a situation that is just absolutely intolerable. If that doesn't produce some changes with all the attendant publicity and media coverage, I think we're going to be in rough shape, particularly going into what could be a near totalitarian administration coming up in January. So, folks, please pay attention to the issue. There's some suggestions on the Virginia Defender Facebook page about what people can do to help. And hopefully we'll have some good news on this story before too long.
Yeah, I hope so. And thanks again, Phil. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
The adjuster, our hero, oh, we know him by his smile. After smiting the Leviathan, he bicycled a mile and vanished into the morning, so we'll never know his name. But he got off 3 clean hits that had put the crooks to shame. Oh, deny, defend, oppose against the CEO heroes, to inspire and plant a seed of propaganda by the deed, and to say we won't sit still while you make us poor and keep us ill. And to all who would make us slaves, we'll be dancing, we'll be dancing, we'll be dancing on your graves. On the cool December morning, winter of 24, the adjuster sent a message: we won't take it anymore. And the execs, they crapped their chaps, and they were right to be afraid, because the executions have started. There's gonna be some changes made. Oh, deny, defend, oppose against the CEO heroes, to inspire and plant a seed of propaganda by the deed, and to say we won't sit still while you make us poor and keep us ill. And to all who would make us slaves, we'll be dancing, we'll be dancing, dancing on your grave. Change your rack or watch your back. Defense is not attack. If you're preying on the people, we'll make sure you can't relax. You all could have backed off any time. Nobody made you do this, but it's too late now. It's going down. You're going to have to go through this. So deny, defend, oppose against the CEO heroes, to inspire and plant a seed of propaganda by the deed, and to say you won't sit still while you make us poor and keep us ill. And to all who would make us slaves, we'll be dancing, we'll be dancing, we'll be dancing on your graves.
Anyway, my name is Jo, and I work in structures against repression, prisons, and in solidarity with persecuted people in Germany for many years already. I am in different groups of solidarity concerning the Antifa-OST case, but also in other structures that support persecuted people. My background is more anarchist, but I'm coming from the east of Germany. Since then, I used to be also in the Antifa because that was like the only choice coming from small towns over there. And I still do understand the necessity of fighting Nazis, but my main issue is more the anti-repression group.
Cool. Thanks for having the chat and having it in English with me. I really appreciate it. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about recent and ongoing repression of anti-fascists in Germany and some of the international ramifications of this. Would you mind giving us an introduction to this, some of the state of fascist presence and anti-fascist action in Eastern Germany, and maybe describe what Antifa-OST means?
Yes, I can. So about like the repression against Antifa people in Germany, it always used to be there, but it increased a lot since one arrest in 2019 of some people who were arrested after an attack on a well-known Nazi from Eisenach, a city in Thuringia in East Germany. And following this arrest, a lot of investigation and also operative measurements started. So many raids and also other arrests happened. And one of our comrades, Lena, was in preventive prison for some years since November 2020. There were like many accused in the same case because they built up some kind of criminal organization around attacks against Nazis all over East Germany and tried to combine all those actions into one structure. Since then, they made a big network out of investigations against a lot of people connected to Antifa. The first case of Antifa-OST, what means like Antifa East, that is connected to East Germany, started in 2021, half a year after, 1 year after Lena was arrested. And they just accused 4 people in the first trial, but there were many other accused all around that were, or they are still waiting for their trials.
Yeah, that's a good starting point. So does Eastern Germany have a higher percentage of street-based fascist organizations than the rest of Germany, or is it just where the fighting is really visible between fascists and anti-fascists?
It's difficult to say if it's now like a big amount of Nazis in East than in West Germany, but the history of street violence is a bit more visible in East Germany because you had these pogroms all over the 90s, also in the West, but more in the East parts of the country. Like in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Antifa developed out of this, but both sides went somehow more reformistic through the last 15, 20 years. And now you can see that Nazis are more strong in the parliaments, especially in the east of Germany. They are the percentage winners of the elections in some parts, but out of coalition of other parties, they are not in power yet. But they are gaining more and more power since then. They can also support like their paramilitary structures in the streets. Well, it's like a close connection in between Nazis and parliament and the street violence that is increasing more and more again.
Cool. Thank you for saying that. And yeah, I know that like when I had spoken with someone a few years ago from NSU Watch about some of the histories of Nazi terrorism and pogroms, I think a lot of that was happening in East Germany back in the 90s that they spoke of. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the case of Lena E. and the charges that are being faced, who's bringing the charges, and how that case resolved.
Okay. Yeah, Lena was arrested in November 2020, almost a year after the attack on this Nazi in Eisenach, where she was arrested together with some other people. And she was in preventive prison until the case was done last year in May. She was imprisoned also with Beate Zschäpe. That is one of the last one that survived the NSU because the other ones suicided themselves. So she was in the same prison as one of the National Socialist underground leaders. The trial lasted almost 100 days from 2021 until last year in May. And The four first accused in this were mainly accused for criminal organization, criminal assault, and coercion. But not all of them were accused for the same things. Like some of them were only accused to be supporters of the criminal organization or being part or supporting specific attacks against Nazis. So it was a bit confusing to see like how they put all of them together. And even though one person is just accused for 1 or 2 attacks, had to stay there the whole 100 days to be persecuted in the end. They were sentenced for the 2 years and 5 months until 5 years and 3 months. That was the highest charge for Lina. And what is interesting in the case is that the case is led by the highest federal prosecutor. That is a political institution that usually takes over terrorist cases, but can also choose to take over other cases as he considers them as close to terrorism. What means that this position is not a position that is considered as a law position, but a political one that can be changed by the people in power, in the political power. Since then, you see how interesting this anti-fascist movement or the anti-fascist actions were also to the people in the political power in the state. And the investigations in the case are made by a special unit against left-wing crimes in Saxony, East Germany. What is kind of a group of cops that is only taking care of attacks out of the so-called left-wing movement, what does not mean just anti-fascist actions, but also anti-authoritarian attacks against gentrification, cops, whatever. Mm-hmm. They also imprisoned Lina in November. She's now out, and they are all, like the 4 of them, waiting for the appeal to go to prison after that. So the final judgment is not done until the appeal is done, but as the whole court case was done in the highest court or the highest possible court, they have just one choice to make an appeal that usually has a rate of 4% to be accepted.
During the case, I thought I remembered there also being a number of unnamed accused, basically unknown defendants that hadn't yet been named for crimes. Am I misremembering that, or is the conspiracy wider than the people that they arrested?
It's much wider than that. They arrested other people than they accused in the first court case, for example. Like the ones that were accused, only 2 of them were arrested in the first attack that they built on the whole investigation against this so-called criminal organization. And there are still some unknown people. And I think the last person that got accused for this criminal organization and the attacks was accused in August this year. So it's an ongoing repression against people. It's like many, many, many raids that happened. But the only one that was in preventive prison until now was Lina. And since November, also Nanook and Johan are imprisoned.
Yeah, and I want to ask a little bit more about Nanook in a moment. But I guess, so it is interesting that this politically appointed prosecutor is taking so much interest in left-wing and anti-fascist organizing. Can you speak a bit about the application of Section 129 AB, what it was devised for, and how it's being applied today?
Yes, this Section 129 exists since 1871 and was usually used against also kind of socialist organizations. But then with the armed struggle in Germany in the late 60s, they added the A, 129A in 1976 and made up a terrorist organization. The B was added just in 2002 after the World Trade Center for a terrorist organization in foreign countries. And in 2017, a new European law also allows to investigate against such an organization without like a concrete founding time or more group members than one, or some ideas about the financing and the place of the organization. And it's supposed to support the persecution of organized crime, but in Germany, for example, especially, it's mainly used against political structures. So it allows them to investigate and to follow any political action, saying that people had a common understanding under this section, this paragraph. And they started like many investigations against such structures, like political structures, in the past years by both the federal prosecutor but also in the federal states. And this gives them more rights for repressive surveillance and operative measures, like also against the surroundings of the suspects, like the families and friends. And yes, beside anti-authoritarian and anti-fascist people, many Kurdish activists and Turkish communists are persecuted and imprisoned in Germany under the 129B.
Is it applied against grey wolves as well?
As far as I know, it's not used against the grey wolves yet, but it's used, for example, against the Nazis that allegedly were beaten up by this criminal organization of Lina and the others. So they use it against both sides, also out of the extremism theory. So they allow themselves to be the so-called middle in between the extremes and also prove their power by saying that those two sides have no right and use it against both.
So like a counterinsurgency tool that would be used against any like destabilizing actor, I guess.
Yes, these and how you call I think they say monopoly of power.
Oh, okay.
So the idea of the state is to keep the monopoly of power by using those laws against both sides to confirm themselves as the middle.
Yeah. So recently, you mentioned Nanook. Nanook was arrested in Berlin. I wonder if you could talk about this situation and how it does relate to the Antifa East or Budapest.
Nanook was arrested because he's accused to be part of the criminal organization around Antifa-OST, but also other cases. He's not accused to be part of the Budapest structure, but you have to see that they connect the Budapest structure and the Antifa East case very deeply. Johan was arrested just a few days afterwards, and he is accused for both.
And could you describe the Budapest structure? So my understanding is that there was the arrest and extradition of people who allegedly participated in an anti-fascist demonstration in Budapest a few years ago. Is this right?
Yes, I could start like a small chronology of what happened.
Could you? Yeah, that would be very helpful.
There was like the case in Dresden against the Antifa East people was still going on when in February 2023, some people were arrested around the March of Honor in Budapest in Hungary, and two of them were Germans. One was already accused in the Antifa East case and also arrested together with Lina in Eisenach in 2019. Since then, the cops made this connection, and they made international warrants against the people all over Europe. One person already made a confession in his trial in Budapest, also saying that he was part of this kind of so-called criminal organization of Antifa East after they were sentenced. Then there was Ilaria from Italy, that she's now in the European Parliament and got political amnesty, since then she's free. In November last year, they arrested Gabri in Milano in Italy. He was released in March. Damaya was arrested in December last year in Berlin also and was extradited to Hungary in June this year. Anna was arrested in May in Nuremberg in Germany in May this year. And then Johan was arrested, as I said, in November. And Gino also was arrested first in Finland. Then he got out somehow and was arrested in Paris also a few weeks ago. So we are not sure about the status about all the extradition trials that are still going on. We do not know if Hannah and Johan are going to be extradited, and Gino has his next trial in December this year. So it could be that all those people also will be transferred to Hungarian prisons. And there are still a dozen people on the run, but we know that the European repressive authorities work together very well and have a good exchange of information.
Boy, that's really dire. Thank you for describing that. I guess before we've already sort of moved a little bit past Lena's case, but there was an instance that I think you had said that you were interested in talking about how one of the defendants in the case turned on the co-defendants. Can you talk about what happened there? As I understand, it was about like repeated abusive behaviors that person had participated in or taken.
Yes, there was one guy that was also accused in the case, but he was not part of the first 4 people who were on trial. That was out-called as a rapist in October, just a month after the trial in Dresden started. And since then, a big debate about patriarchal violence also inside the militant anti-fascist movement started. This guy left to Warsaw to live over there and refused to make a process about his patriarchal behavior. And he was interviewed by the secret services of Germany in March the year after and decided to cooperate with the repressive authorities. And he is still doing that. So he was snitching against many people from all over Germany and also made a confession or testimony in the Dresden case. He was speaking there for many days against the people who were accused there, but also about other persons. And he was one of the main reasons for these high sentences because the judges believed him and did not think that he had any own interest in revenge against those people. But the interesting part about this is like that beside the snitching moment, people started. The thing is that after that, a lot of people started to think about how people get connected to this kind of structure that are acting very violent in a political way also, but they do not have a deep level of debate or discussions or reflection about sexism, patriarchy, and other layers of political involvement, and also no deep criticism on the system and the state. Since then, it's much easier to just take part in specific stuff and go to snitch as long as you're not being part of a movement that has all those reflections in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important discussion that I feel like has been long overdue in a lot of like militant movements. In your interpretation, do you see like pretty good progress with normalizing critiques of things like this, homophobia, sexist violence, and the values that are associated with that within anti-fascist movement?
It was a bit too much the polarization on him and the other people in the Antifa-OST case, because it was obvious that he was not the only man who had this kind of behavior. But slowly, it is more a structural reflection in different groups and parts of the movement, and not so much concentrated anymore on this specific group of accused people. But in the beginning, it was a bit difficult to make the understanding of the snitch not to be one monster, but one of the movement that can easily enter it out of this behavior of being somebody who can be used as kind of a soldier in this kind of action.
Mm-hmm. Stepping back a bit, in the last decade or so, and you mentioned this earlier, but like far-right parties like Alternative for Germany, AfD, and Homeland, or the NPD, have been gaining parliamentary representation throughout parts of Germany and in the European Parliament. Also, we've seen clear cases of collusion and overlap between far-right movements like Reichsbürgers and police and military in the case of Day X, which we spoke about at that earlier NSU Watch discussion that folks can listen back to if they want to. Have these trends towards far-right groups having more representation in government, have they been accompanied by more repression of anti-fascists?
Those structures and groups are still not so much in power that they have any kind of influence on the law or directly influence on cops. But after many years, full of a lot of scandals about the connection of like military and cops with Nazis, or the Nazis inside the cop and military structures, it's kind of normal now. So there's no scandal anymore. Whatever happens, there are like many Nazi chat groups inside the police. Also, in the case of Antifa-OST, it was obvious that there were Nazis who were not allowed anymore to work as police officers, but they still did their testimony against the people in the Dresden case. And they also gave the pictures of the people and the files to the Nazis. So they published a lot of stuff that was not supposed to be public on their blogs and newspapers and stuff. But this did not lead so much towards like a more radical anti-fascist opposition, or however it's called. It's more like people do not know how to deal with this massive is right-wing power that they gain for now. And about like the other parties, it's easy to say that obviously they work more against migrants and left-wing movements because they would like to gain back those people who vote for the right-wing parties, since then the so-called middle is going more far right than the Nazis themselves sometimes.
Can you talk a bit about the international nature of anti-fascist resistance in the face of ongoing far-right violence, as well as increased intergovernmental cooperation in repressing grassroots resistance from the left?
To be honest, there's not so much anymore. Like, there were some demonstrations in solidarity with the arrested and accused people, especially in the Budapest case in different countries. And people made like information and discussion events internationally. They did supportive actions, wrote texts, also funds for the persecuted. But it's more like a defensive position right now compared to the times of the anti-globalization movements, where people came together in other ways and had like different connections than it is nowadays.
And how can people learn more or offer support around these cases?
Like all those anti-repression structures, like the solid groups of the different cases, have blogs that people can inform themselves, sometimes even in English. Should I tell you?
Yeah, if you would.
So there's solely-antifa-ost.org and the basc.news. Those are the two bigger blogs that combine all the information about the Antifa-OST case and the Budapest case. And what to do is like fight Nazis and fight the states. It seems like you have your own problems.
Yeah.
coming up fascist state over there. So I don't think that this is a European problem or a German problem, but it's going to be a worldwide one, since then it's needed to fight Nazis and this system all over the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having this conversation. Is there anything that occurs to you now that I didn't ask about that you'd like to say?
I think I did not speak about the Antifa movement, like the change of the Antifa movement from the 90s to now. What was something that I added after the part about the Nazis and the street violence?
You mentioned that it's, things are not like in the days of the anti-globalization movement. I guess, could you talk about how the anti-fascist movements have shifted and grown since that period?
Yes, like the Antifa turned also to be more a reformistic structure, organization, movement, but it's still organized also in like smaller groups that fight Nazis in the streets. The problem was the minimal consensus against Nazis. There was often not a strong position against the system and the state. And we also had the problem with many debates about militants and violence inside the movement. So the people who are more close to the state and still consider themselves Antifa are sometimes very much in trouble with the people who fight Nazis in the streets or build up structures who do this kind of actions against them.
Do you think that shift, does it reflect a wider weakening of autonomous social movements, or what caused the more reformist nature to develop within anti-fascist circles?
It seems like it was the belief in gaining more people in the streets against the increasing problem with the Nazis, even though the autonomous and anti-authoritarian people beforehand were very successful in the fights against Nazis. But it came kind of in a parallel move that Nazis started to build up parties to be part of the elections, and then people started to fight against them, also together with other political parties and unions and stuff. And this caused the problem that there is not the criticism that is needed against the state and the system.
Too much of like a popular front strategy that watered down the politics.
Kind of an appeasement strategy also, that lots of structures were kind of supported by the states. They are like so-called autonomous centers that are financed by like the federal state itself. People are depending on the state's money in many cases. So all those structures are depending on the state, and this is kind of usual now, but before it used to be very much criticized, but also because like lots of squads were evicted and lots of possibilities that the movement had beforehand are not there anymore.
Yeah. Squats were evicted or legalized, right?
Yeah, the legalization of squats is another problem. But exactly, like autonomous spaces do not exist so much anymore. The legalization of the squats was already happening in the end of 80s and beginning of 90s. But like new development of like this kind of social centers and legalized projects that are depending on the states or the cities also came up a bit later, and people have no criticism anymore towards these dependencies. And now you can see in East Germany, in the parts where the AfD is winning the elections, that people are going to be afraid that they're going to lose all their local structures and financed projects.
Are you seeing much conversation about ending a reliance on those state-supported structures because they could be taken away at any time, or are people just sort of panicking and assuming the worst? Like, are they taking agency?
Like, to me, it seems more like the second. Like, people are just trying to prepare themselves how on the law side they can fight against this, but it's not part of any radicalization of the movement so far.
Well, on that depressing note, thank you again for having this conversation. I appreciate it. Now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
Did you know that the state of Michigan has a Michigan Walk of Fame to honor historically significant Michiganders? I'm from Michigan, and I just found out about it. Each of the honorees has a plaque on the sidewalk surrounding the Capitol in Lansing. As of now, there are 24 honorees, including civil rights activist Rosa Parks, musician Stevie Wonder, and former President Gerald Ford. Andrew Blackbird and Fannie M. Richards were educators. They've got plaques on the Walk of Fame, along with the state librarian. Pearl Kendrick and Grace Elderling developed a vaccine for whooping cough. It must have worked. I don't know anyone who's ever had whooping cough. Jonas Salk has had his plaque, too, for developing the vaccine for polio. Emma Genevieve Gillette is hailed as the mother of Michigan's national parks, which is pretty cool. She's on the Walk of Fame with Eero Saarinen, an architect who designed the Gateway Arch, and Elijah McCoy and Thomas Edison, inventors, all Michiganders. There's sportscaster Ernie Harwell and journalist Helen Thomas, former UAW President Walter Reuther, automotive pioneer William C. Durant, actors Jeff Daniels and Danny Thomas, sports figures Joe Louis and Gordie Howe. Last, and certainly least, are capitalist moguls Will Keith Kellogg of the Breakfast Cereal Company, Herbert Henry Dow, who founded the Chemical Corporation, and anti-Semite Henry Ford, who invented the assembly line. But do you know the historically significant Michigander who has been conspicuously left off of this Walk of Fame? Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain. This is clearly an oversight that must be rectified. I'm sure all of you dedicated and committed savage cannibal Swainiacs out there agree. So I'm going to share with you the letter that I have written to the Michigan Walk of Fame. You can feel free to contact them as well and use these talking points or perhaps include your own, describing my great and indispensable contributions to the world in which we now live. Anyway, my letter. Dear Michigan Walk of Fame, my name is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, and I am writing to you in hopes of persuading you to rectify a grave oversight relating to the Michigan Walk of Fame. I'm not on it. It is my hope that you have not excluded me due to your ignorance of my importance to the world, and that you are just saving the best for last. While the argument for my inclusion is pretty self-evident, as I am the very heart and soul of what it means to be from Michigan, I will rattle off just a few pertinent facts here. I've written 3 awesome and transformational books now in publication, and I have contributed over 10 years of insightful and earth-shattering observations in my commentaries for the Final Straw radio show, which is preferred globally by 9 out of 10 ski mask-clad, machete-wielding, dumpster-burning radical maniacs. I've spent over 30 years held hostage by the obvious enemy of all of humanity and the scourge of the world as we know it, Ohio. And I would argue that Ohio hates me with a scope and breadth of unmitigated scorn with which it despises no one else, principally because I embody the greatest and most virtuous values reflected in what it means to be a Michigander. That is, I withstand all of the repulsive evil that Ohio may spew at me, and I continue my courageous fight just for you, Michigan. Go Lions, go Tigers, go Pistons, go Red Wings. I have declared myself Ohio governor in exile and president in exile after several election cycles. In fact, I'm president in exile right now. Now, admittedly, I have not created vaccines to diseases like Jonas Salk, Pearl Kendrick, or Grace Eldering. But I'm also not a Nazi like Henry Ford, and I didn't mass-produce napalm for mega-profit like Herbert Henry Dow. I mean, I'm not going to snivel here, but Eero Saarinen, the guy who created the Gateway Arch, the Greeks invented the arch several decades ago, and they weren't even part of the United States yet. You've got Jeff Daniels on there. I've seen his movies. In his greatest work, the film doesn't even clarify whether he's dumb or dumber. But I did serve in the U.S. Army as a supply clerk, where I handed out rifles and toilet paper to recruits who probably used both of them wrong. And during my service, I contracted both chlamydia and gonorrhea from an exotic dancer named Daisy with a tattoo of Winnie the Pooh on the inside of her left ankle. I didn't get the Purple Heart for that, but I did get a shot of penicillin in my ass to clear up the stinky mozzarella in my shorts. I've been confined by Ohio for 33 years and counting for a provable non-crime because, as you well know, Ohio is a filthy, toxic hate hole, a dark, slimy cesspool of pig vomit and rat excrement where even light itself cannot escape. I'm the Nelson Mandela of Michigan, the Sacco and Vanzetti of Motown. My personal papers and effects were archived at the University of Michigan, you know, so that proves I'm a pretty big deal. Go Wolverines. I stand defiant for you, Michigan. So, can I get my f***ing plaque on the sidewalk or what? Hugs. Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain. Future honoree, Michigan Walk of Fame. Now, if all of you out there are as committed to getting me on the Michigan Walk of Fame as I think you should be, you can contact the Michigan Walk of Fame by snail mail, 401 South Washington, Lansing, Michigan, 48933, or by phone, 517-487-3322, or by fax, 517-488-5899. And please, no faxing your butt cheeks or genitals this time. This isn't the ODRC central office. This is serious. You can also email them, info@michiganwalkoffame.com. Who knows? If we get enough support behind this, they may just name the whole street after me. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, future honoree for the Michigan Walk of Fame at the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.